I have a confession to make before I start. My biggest challenge this morning is really not to deliver the presentation as such. My biggest challenge would be to stay still here for the next 20 minutes. So that's going to take quite a task, but I'll try to achieve that. I wanted to first start by setting the scene and setting everything I have to say in the context of infection control. Obviously, it's an infection control conference, infection control event. And so I'll be speaking on sepsis, as has been said. And I guess there are two things to immediately point out, regardless of on what side of the argument you land as far as administration of antibiotics is concerned and sepsis and when to do that and when not to do it. Regardless of that, the fact remains that it is an issue for us to look at. So AMR is an issue in sepsis and how we intervene and take things forward. I guess the second important point to make before going forward really is the fact about quality improvement. Everyone in the room at some point or another has already had some intervention or some experience of quality improvement or QI, and in going forward, we will continue to have those experiences. We will continue to strive to exceed ourselves. We will continue to strive to improve on what we've done, and so a lot of what I say, and definitely the innovation I'll be speaking about, is in the context of quality improvement. So essentially, I'll be talking about a tool that is meant to empower quality improvers on the front line. I guess the final thing to then say really is that I have a number of slides. Actually, I have a slide deck. I know for a fact that in 20 minutes, I will not go through all those slides. That would take a miracle to achieve that. And so I say beforehand, pardon me if I don't go through the entire slide deck. However, having said that, honestly, what I would have preferred to do is not to have any slides at all. But if I did that, potentially I understand there are about 400 people in the room. I don't want news going around town that this chap rolled in from London and didn't even prepare for the presentation. All he did was to stand in front of us and tell stories. So this is the technical aspect of the presentation. I'll take that out of the way, then I'll talk about things which I really think make things work. Honestly, everything I say in terms of the technical aspect, you could possibly read in a book or make up in some shape or form. However, I'm hoping that the experience I've had and the experience I've had with the team and the people I've been privileged to work with is probably something that's unique to us. And I share this with all humility, to be honest, in the sense of this is not a recipe for how things will always work. This is a presentation of the experience that we've had and perhaps how you might adapt it and use it in your own context. So I thought it was important to set the scene in that respect. And so that's the topic I'll be speaking on, Suspicion of Sepsis Insights dashboard. How did we assemble a collaboration nationally to make this piece of work, and also what lessons did we learn? So I'll quickly whiz through this, and I heard David announce about the Twitter handles. Those are my Twitter handles. Mine personally, the National Patient Safety Improvement Program, which the organization that's generously sponsored the work that we do. And the organization I work for, Imperial College Health Partners, we're based in Northwest London, and we have responsibility for innovation and collaboration across the entire patch in Northwest London for a healthier population is what we try to achieve. So, taking this further, here are a few questions I'm hoping I'll answer in the course of the maybe 15 minutes left now. First, what's the problem with measuring sepsis outcomes? How does the Suspicion of Sepsis Insight dashboard attempt to solve that problem? And very importantly, what are the further opportunities for collaborating on the use of the dashboard? Now, let me just put it out there beforehand that only last week, We finished the pilot for the second generation of the dashboard, and for reasons which I hope I'll get to, we have decided to, actually based on feedback from you and a number of colleagues across the country, we have decided to change the name to Bacterial Infection and Sepsis Dashboard, and I think that would resonate more with some of the people in the room, for the simple reason that describing it strictly in the context of sepsis was a bit restrictive. Describing it in the context of bacterial infection and sepsis is a bit more representative of what it really does. So those are the things that I hope I'll be able to answer. I'm going to skip through this slide because it just describes the geography in which I work, but perhaps I won't have time to deal with that. So I guess let's set the scene by putting sepsis in the context of bacterial infections. As everyone in the room would know, it's a severe life-threatening condition, arises when the body attacks its own tissues and organs in response to an infection. Now, that's important because nobody has ever yet had sepsis without first having a bacterial infection. And that's important for the kind of tool that we have innovated, if you like. Now, the problem we've been trying to solve is this. Before now, measurement of sepsis outcomes has been a very huge challenge before now. And there are three reasons why that's the case. The first is that the actual definition of sepsis, as you would know, keeps fluctuating. And so, in a sense, sepsis itself is a moving target. Add to that the fact that there is a lack of consistency in the way we code for sepsis. So many people in the room would be familiar with the concept of the so-called ICD-10 codes. And traditionally, we would code sepsis in terms of A40 and A41, which are the designated codes. We do know from experience that doing that is as good as putting a finger in the air because it just fluctuates and the data is unreliable. And finally, we've got the fact that there's still no definite diagnostic gold standard test for sepsis. Add all that together, and what you have is no reliable way of measuring sepsis outcomes, at least until recently. And so, for an improver or a quality improver in the field on the front line, that poses a real huge problem. It poses a problem not just between departments in the same hospital or the same trust, but also between trusts in the same region, and of course, between regions across the nation. So how do we know that we're really measuring and comparing apples for apples and pears for pears rather than apples and pears? It's essentially what we've tried to do. Now, this is how we currently record sepsis data. So a patient comes into hospital, we do a diagnosis, and based on the diagnosis, the records go to the medical records, and then they allocate some codes, and based on that, they then send that information to NHS Digital, which then becomes part of the so-called HES data, or hospital episode statistics data, and we use that for so many different things, as you would know. So, moving on swiftly, here lies the problem. Here is where the problem goes. So, the way we currently measure sepsis, as I say, is that there are 68,000 ICD-10 codes in total, and they are used for classification of diseases, as you know. There are 250 bacteria infection codes in that lot as such, and 2 are specifically dedicated to sepsis. Now, they are so-called A40 and A41. To cut through the chase, the real problem is that when you focus on A40 and A41 exclusively, the picture is very unreliable, it's inconsistent, and can be quite misleading. However, a colleague by the name Martin and Akim and colleagues in Wessex did a piece of work, a pioneering piece of work, and published a BMJ paper on the back of that, and they looked at 250 validated ICD-10 codes, and they proposed to measure sepsis and bacterial infection outcomes based on that. And that's the piece of work that we have developed on. So in some sense, Matt and his team did the technical work, if you like. They came up with a mathematical formula, if you like. And then we took that mathematical formula, and I say figuratively that we developed it into an engineering solution. So a dashboard that people can refer to and use. So here is what life looks like if you start to look at the data. So there are 3 different curves on that graph. The first one is the green solid line. And the green solid line is what happens when you look at emergency admissions, which are coded A40 and A41. Now, you can already see that we have a problem because that would suggest that if you were to look at sepsis, A40 and A41, within a 2-year period, that the number of people were seen for sepsis actually doubled, nearly tripled in a 2-year period. Now, that in itself doesn't add up clinically, so we know there's a problem. Now, the red dotted line across the page is the total number of people coming into hospital for emergency admission. And the red solid line at the bottom is the total number of people coded as suspicion of sepsis, or the so-called 250 ICD-10 codes, which we are now referring to as bacterial infection and sepsis codes. Now, the interesting thing is 2 things to note before we move on from here. First is notice that the red dotted line and the red solid line pretty much mirror themselves. And we've known for a while that plus or minus, the total population of people coming into hospital for infection is fairly constant. And so that resemblance in the 2 curves would seem to validate that position. I guess the other thing to also note is that notice that unlike the green line, which describes A40 and A41, notice that the red solid line is constant over time, which is, again, the sort of thing we'll expect. So when we look at this data, it begins to give us some confidence that the information and the data we're putting out there is actually accurate, and that it's more reflective of the situation on the front line. Now, let me just quickly do a poll, an on-the-spot poll. How many colleagues in the room have actually either seen or used or interacted with the Suspicion of Sepsis Insights dashboard? It may even be that you are one of the people who helped us pilot within the last 2 or 3 weeks. Can I just see a show of hands? Right, okay. There are about 4 Suspicion of Sepsis ambassadors dotted around the room. So I guess, so that's the context in which we were trying to solve the problem. Again, what we then noticed was if you were to track A40 and A41, what you will find over time is that really what you're tracking is just a fluctuation in national events. And I won't go through those in detail, but it does mention some of those things that account for those spikes. Now, so the summary of this really is we have a problem in the sense that to measure the scale, frequency, and outcomes of sepsis, and to do it reliably, to do it in a reliable, consistent, and reproducible way was a problem until we came up with the idea of the Suspicion of Sepsis Insights dashboard, which we're now calling Bacterial Infection and Sepsis dashboard. Now, so in a nutshell, what we're trying to do is to provide a tool in the hands of clinicians that will help them to improve care, reduce harm, and achieve better outcomes with sepsis by producing a fast, accurate, targeted data on sepsis and bacterial outcomes. And at the moment, you can access the tool at that address. So that's where you can find the tool. It's retrospective data. It's free at the point of access. The data is completely anonymized, so there are no data consent issues. There are also no data interoperability issues. And on top of that, there are no patient consent issues. So it's just ready there for you to use. Now, just a number of things that the data does and ways you might use it. So first is that it provides information, general information about total admissions, and splits that out into suspicion of sepsis and sepsis, but also it provides information on bed days and also splits that by ICU admissions, and standard bed admissions. And finally, it also provides information on outcomes, if you like, so mortality, or if you prefer, survival, and so on and so forth. And you can toggle between mortality and survival and between suspicion of sepsis and sepsis. And one of the things that colleagues tell us over the last year or so, perhaps a little more, since September 2018, really is that one of the things they found helpful about this is previously, if you wanted information about how your trust was performing across that spectrum, what you would have to do is to get your own data and try and perhaps validate or benchmark with other colleagues across the country, and that exercise could easily take you 2 days. Now, you can go straight to a dashboard, and in 5 minutes, you can download if that. In 2 minutes, you can download all the data you need for your trust, for your region, and nationally. And now we've also included the opportunity or the function to really compare between trusts, not for the purpose of performance or for judgmental calls, but for the purpose of improvement, so for the purpose of learning. Now, so essentially, we would like you to track your data, understand the data, and use that to plan quality improvement. So I'll go on to the final bit of the conversation, if you like. And there are 4 lessons I think that I have learned, and perhaps the team have learned in the last 2 years or so. And I'll summarize those in, if you like, 4 nuggets. Now, the first really is that the biggest thing about partnership is that you first need to engage the process of partnership. And this kind of work takes partnership to deliver. Engage the process of partnership. And there are 2 things that stand out for me on that. First is engagement, and the other is process. Right, and I have 2 minutes more. So that's the first one, engage the process. And I recall back in 2.5 years ago when this piece of work started, how we were privileged to be able to attract a national interest group of people literally across many different spectrums, nurses, doctors, coders, medical record practitioners, and so on and so forth, who came together, ICU specialists, just to help us to make this happen. And so engagement is a very key process, and that's always going to be important in quality improvement. I guess the second thing that we've learned is that you've then got to endure the pain of partnership. I wish I could stand here and tell you that it was all hunky-dory and that the process was smooth. Actually, it was everything but smooth, to be absolutely honest. So first, I can tell anecdotes and stories which I haven't got time to tell today, but the very first expert that I spoke to about this idea basically told me in words which I won't necessarily describe right now, but essentially they told me that I was out with the cookies in dreamland and what we were proposing would never happen. It's counterintuitive and it will never happen. And then I learned a very important lesson subsequently. So we took that idea and then I ventured to present that idea to a room full of clinicians. And I learned a very important story, a very important lesson, I should say, which is this, and this is part of the pain, which is never, as a non-practicing clinician, be stranded in a room full of clinicians without your bulletproof vest on. Presenting data, don't do it. I have kind of grown a bit since then, and I still venture occasionally on days like this to stand in front of a room full of clinicians. But seriously, how we found a way around that was to get clinicians who believed in our course to present clinical data to clinicians, and that seemed to have worked. So we learned that lesson. I guess the third point we learned is, and I probably am running out of time now, but one final minute. The third lesson we've learned really is that after you have engaged the process, after you have endured the pain, then you need to exploit the power. I have been so amazed at how altruistic and how giving and generous colleagues have been across the nation. I'll cite one example, Martin and Kim in particular. Matt, at a point in time, before this work really picked up, Matt had a paper that he'd already submitted on the original piece of work, the pioneering piece of work. And I approached him, I'd never met him. I sent him an email out of the blues and said, Matt, I'm doing this piece of work. We'd like to really put this in the public domain. Would you like to share your data? And Matt says, I'll be happy to share my data. Now, that is completely unthinkable. Here is a guy who is on the verge of publishing a paper that could possibly change the landscape. A stranger approaches him and says, would you like to share your data before publishing? and it says, yes, I'll believe in the good of humanity and I'll share it. There are so many people in the NHS that are so altruistic in that respect, and that's one of the reasons we're in this room today. If he hadn't shared it, who knows? Maybe this idea might have never seen the light of day. And I think the final point I'll make, and then I'll sit down, is this: that after you've engaged the process, after you've endured the pain, after you've exploited the power, then the next most important thing is to sit back and enjoy the profit. Because profit does come at the end of it. Profit of, how would I know 2.5 years ago that we will stand in a place where 119 trusts, as at the last count, are actually using the Suspicion of Sepsis Insights dashboard, that it will be included in the long-term plan, that the health secretary himself would take personal interest in it, and that we would be able to reach so many clinicians who are now taking the data and doing very good work across the country. Here is the final request I have, and then I'll keep quiet. And it's this: we're about to launch the second version of the dashboard, and please do interact with it. We'll send some information out nationally on that. And we are then also going to launch a bidding process where organizations can take that data and use it to actually demonstrate real-world impact of how you can take data and improve quality on the front line. And we're hoping that you would engage with that process. And thank you very much for your audience.